Dear listeners, thank you for joining today's webinar. I am Maria Schwierep, the chair of the HKICPA Ethics Committee, and today I would like to talk to you about the recent exposure draft issued by the HKICPA on the revisions to the definition of listed entity and public interest entity to the Code of Ethics. So let me start now with the disclaimer, which I will not cover in the detail. And moving on, first, I thought I will read to you the structure of the HKICPA Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants. The Code of Ethics in Hong Kong comprises 6 chapters, which are labeled from Chapter A to Chapter F. Chapter A has been adapted from the International Code of Ethics for Professional Accountants, developed by the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants, IESBA. Chapter A establishes the fundamental principles of professional ethics for professional accountants and provides a conceptual framework that professional accountants shall apply. Chapter B is not being used at the moment. And then Chapter C sets out additional ethical requirements which were developed locally on specific areas or activities, such as, for example, the changes in professional appointment and practice promotion. Chapter D then compares Part A of the HKICPA Code with the IESBA International Code. Differences are mainly to address the legal and regulatory requirements in Hong Kong. Chapter C sets out the ethical requirements that apply to specialized areas of practice, for example, liquidation and insolvency practice. And the last chapter, F, sets out the guidelines on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing for professional accountants and has been effective since March 1st, 2018. These guidelines are based on the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorist Financing Ordinance and aim to ensure compliance by HKICPA members with the prescribed requirements to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing activities. Now I would like to move on to the IESBA revisions to the definition of listed entity and public interest entity in the code. IESBA released the final pronouncement in April 2022, and it sets out mandatory high-level PIE categories, which are subject to local refinement. In addition to local refinement, additional PIE categories could be added by the relevant local bodies, as well as by firms to determine whether to treat additional entities as PIEs. The IESBA has issued the final pronouncement and basis for conclusions, and as well had a webinar and frequently asked questions. The details where you can get this information are listed on the slide. So in the rest of the presentation, I will be covering the why, how, and what these revisions to the code represent. Starting with the why. Why have these revisions? The overarching objective was primarily for the purpose of adding additional independent requirements for PIEs. As to how, the code has been revised to include certain mandatory categories, applying a top-down approach. These are subject to local bodies' refinement. However, there cannot be any subtraction of these categories. The bottom-up approach is to create additional PIE categories by the local bodies. So they will take into account the local circumstances, and the guide includes framework of public interest factors to be used as a reference. In addition, there could be additional non-PIEs which firms will consider to treat as PIEs. The guide also includes granular factors which are to be taken into account, and it is paired with the transparency requirement. So all the three, the top-down, bottom-up, and additional non-PIEs will represent the additional PIEs under the revisions made to the code. As to what these revisions represent, these essentially represent additional independence requirements for PIEs. Let me now explain a bit further on the overarching objective, which is covered in paragraphs 400.8 and 400.10. These explain why the code have additional independence requirements for PIEs. The overarching objective is to address the significant public interest in the financial condition of an entity. Now, when talking about the financial condition of an entity, we're referring to the potential impact of their financial well-being on stakeholders. 410 talks about how stakeholders have heightened expectations regarding the independence of a firm performing an audit engagement for a PIE because of the significance of the public interest in the financial condition of the entity. Now, the financial condition focuses on financial health, not on other aspects of the entity, such as, for example, operational, ESG, environmental aspects, or how well it provides services to the public. The focus is financial condition. To support the evaluation, paragraph 400.9 provides non-exhaustive list of 6 factors in evaluating the level of public interest. These include the nature of the business, the size, number and nature of stakeholders, whether the entity is subject to regulatory supervision, the importance of the entity to the sector in which it operates, the potential systematic impact on other sectors and the economy. Now, it is important to note that in IESBA's view, each of the factors on its own may not amount to significant public interest in the financial condition of an entity, and that they should not be considered in isolation. Moving now to the how, what entities are the PIEs under the revised code? We make reference to paragraph R417. So there are 3 specific mandatory categories in 17A to C, namely publicly traded entity, deposit-taking institutions, and insurers. And then by applying the factors in R418, the local bodies responsible for setting ethics standards for professional accountants will then add categories of PIEs to meet the requirements set out under paragraph D, which becomes therefore an entity specified as such by law, regulation, or professional standards. These are the entities that are considered to meet the purpose described in paragraph 410, which I outlined earlier, which are the heightened stakeholders' expectations in the independence of firm conducting an audit of PIE. On top of these, firms are required to treat certain entities as PIEs for the purpose of Part 4A of the code, which covers the independence of the auditors performing the relevant work. On the refinement and local level, what is the role of local bodies? So relevant local bodies are considered to play a significant role within the code's PIE definition framework. So the IESBA code currently provides a high-level categories at a global level. However, the local bodies are required now to more explicitly define the mandatory categories, as well as to include additional categories that are expected to have public interest. As I mentioned earlier, the local bodies cannot exclude entire mandatory categories. And when they come to refinement of the mandatory categories, the code provides guidance and also provides a list of examples. For example, by making reference to specific public markets for trading securities, or making reference to the local law or regulation defining banks or insurance companies. May also incorporate exemptions for specific types of entities, such as an entity with mutual ownership, as well as setting size criteria for certain types of entities. So this is part of the local refinement. In addition, it is anticipated that the local bodies will add categories of PIEs, and they gave examples, such as, for example, pension funds, collective investment funds, large private entities, not-for-profit organizations or governmental entities, and public utilities. Furthermore, the individual firms themselves are now to determine additional entities as PIEs, and guidance has been provided in the code to assist the firms to determine whether certain entities which by themselves do not meet the mandatory category or the additional entities added by the local bodies to treat them as PIEs. So one can refer to the 6 factors that I've mentioned earlier, and in addition, there are further guidance provided in 419A1. Some examples could include, for example, the entity is likely to become a PIE in the near future, or predecessor firm has applied independence requirements for PIEs to the entity, or the firm has applied independence requirements for PIEs to other entities. So these are the sort of factors that are already included in the code for reference by the firms. So that's in a nutshell is the code revised by the IESBA. And as you could understand, there's a lot of local refinements that are expected to be done by the local bodies. So in March 2002, the HKICPA Ethics Committee started its consultation process with regulators, industry-specific practitioners, and other stakeholders to determine these refinements to the PIE within the context of Part 4A of the HKICPA code. So here on the slide, you have a bit more detail of the consultation process, which I'm not going to go through them. Here is for reference. And it then released the ED last month, and the public consultation is therefore going to be from 27th February to 27th April 2024, a 2-month consultation period. The tentative date is in July of the same year, 2024. The final pronouncement will be issued, and the effective date will be 15 December 2024. I now would like to take you through the proposed local refinements. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 mandatory categories, publicly traded entity being one of them. It is currently for PTE proposed that there will be no local refinement. Entities listed in accordance with the listing rules of the Hong Kong Exchange would be considered as PTE, which is in line with the existing code. Currently, the definition states that it's an entity whose shares, stock, or debt are quoted or listed on a recognized stock exchange or are marketed under the regulations of a recognized stock exchange or other equivalent body. So, no refinement to PTE, to publicly traded entity. Then the next mandatory category is an entity, one of whose main functions is to take deposits from the public. So in Hong Kong, there is the 3-tiered banking system: licensed banks, restricted license banks, and deposit-taking companies. The financial condition of licensed banks which accept deposits from a significant portion of the general public in Hong Kong is considered to be of significant public interest, as any financial failure of such AIs would shake the confidence of the Hong Kong financial system and would impose a serious impact on society. In contrast, the customer base and market share of RLBs and DTCs are relatively limited, resulting in a comparatively smaller public interest impact to the economy and the general public. Accordingly, the proposal in the ED is that only licensed banks, LBs, as defined under the Banking Ordinance, are PIEs in Part 4A of the Code. One point to note is that if there is no statutory requirement for an audit to be performed, so for example, like local branch of foreign banks don't need such an audit, then these revisions do not apply. On the third mandatory category, which is the provision of insurance to the public, the exposure draft is proposing all insurers other than captive insurers will fall within the code. The reason why the captive insurers are considered not to be a PIE is because effectively a captive insurer is an insurance company set up by its parent company with the primary purpose of insuring and reinsuring the risks of the companies in the group. Accordingly, it was considered or felt that captive insurers do not have public interest and as such are being excluded. Now, similar to the banking situation, if a branch, for example, is required to provide an audit and there is no statutory requirement, then these revisions will not apply. Also, further point to note is that since the amendments only apply to Part 4A of the Code, IESBA has not made any amendment to Part 4B of the Code, which set out independence requirements for assurance engagements. As such, assurance engagements other than audits or reviews of historical financial information will not be covered by these revisions. So if one looks at the requirements for banks and insurance companies, such as banking returns, insurance returns, or even sustainability reports, the revisions will not apply. Now, moving on to the fourth bullet point here, which is an entity specified as such by law, regulation, or professional standards. IESBA's proposed revisions to the definition of listed entity and PIE, which were published in 2021, had considered PEBs, the post-employment benefits and collective investment vehicles, so PEBs and SIVs, as potentially mandatory PIE categories, taking into account the likelihood that these categories will be adopted by most jurisdictions as PIEs, and also taking into account their impact on a large number of stakeholders in the event of a financial failure for entities in these two categories. After considering the feedback received, IESBA decided to remove both PEBs and SIVs from the mandatory list. However, the HKICPA, for purpose of the local refinement, take into account pension funds and funds authorized by the SFC as potential categories of PIEs in Part 4A of the Code. So it did extensive research as part of the implementation of these revisions. So starting first with the pension funds, it was felt that based on the factors reflected earlier, mandatory provident funds as registered under the Mandatory Provident Fund Schemes Ordinance meet the definition of PIE. With respect to also those schemes which are occupational retirement schemes registered under the Occupational Retirement Schemes Ordinance, after considering their nature, their unavailability to the general public, and taking into account the disproportionate high number of also schemes compared to the asset size of each scheme and the low population penetration rate, the proposed local refinement was to apply a size criteria to target those also schemes with a substantive public interest as PIE. Accordingly, the ED issued recently covering also schemes, it is proposing that only those schemes with total assets exceeding 100 million Hong Kong dollars by reference to the most recent set of audited financial statements will be considered as PIE. Now, with respect to the other funds, like the funds authorized by SFC, the Institute did extensive research, then decided to defer determining whether SFC authorized funds should be classified as PIEs within Part 4A of the Code to a phase 2 of the local refinement. The objective is that it is intended that further research will be done by IESBA on the PEBs and CIFs, on their arrangements and relationships with trustees. So it seemed relevant to take into account any conclusive decision taken by them in this area. It's not just trustees, they will also be looking at managers and advisors. Likewise, certain major jurisdictions are still doing their own research to determine whether to treat open-ended funds as PIEs. So it was felt that it may be too premature to reach a decision as to whether SFC authorized funds are to be treated as PIEs at this stage. So it's being deferred to a phase 2 of the revisions. Now, that in brief are the revisions for the HKICPA code. In the exposure draft, there are certain requests for specific comments. So looking at the mandatory PIE categories, the request for comment is whether you agree with the proposal. First, to define those entities as licensed banks as defined under the banking ordinance as PIEs. Then with the insurers, to define authorized insurers as defined under the insurance ordinance, except for captive insurers as PIEs. Now, both banks and insurers, there's also the exclusion for those where there is no statutory requirement for audit engagements to be performed. And then with respect to those entities which are being added at a local level, to advise whether you agree that all MPF schemes registered under MPF ordinance and also schemes registered under also with total assets exceeding 100 million to be included as PIEs. As I mentioned earlier, the HKICPA is taking the approach of issuing the revisions in 2 phases. So phase 1 focused on refining the IESBA's mandatory PIE categories, as well as deliberating on the classification of pension funds and funds authorized by the SFC's SPIEs. So these are laid out in the recent ED, and it's what is being covered so far. Phase 2 is intended to include further research on the SFC authorized funds and organizations that handle client assets as part of their primary business, as well as other PIE categories that were identified by IESBA, but considered not to include them as PIE categories at a global level. These include charities, financial market infrastructure providers, public utilities, and systematically significant entities. According to the timeline of IESBA, the research and outreach with stakeholders will be done this year. They will then issue an exposure draft in 2025, and the final pronouncement will be released in 2026. As part of this phase 2, there will be potentially another round of public consultation to include other categories of entities in the local definition of PIE in Part 4A of the code in due course. So in the ED phase 1, there's also a request for specific comment as to whether you have any comments on the possible classification of certain SFC authorized funds, organizations that handle client assets as part of their primary business, organizations that receive government subvention, charities, financial market infrastructure, public utilities, and systematically significant entities. As you can see, there's quite a long list of potential entities that may be considered as PIEs. So any comments you may have in this area will be very welcome. Now, the links to the ED invitation to comment and the explanatory memorandum, which does go into detail about the research done, the basis of conclusion, I do urge you to have a look at them because they affect a reasonably large change to the definition of PIEs here in the local market. The deadline is 27th of April. Comments may be sent to the email shown here, or fax as well. You can mail it to the HKICPA Standard Setting Department. Thank you for listening and have a good day.